The order was simple: throw it away. King Jumong of Buyeo had seen strange things in his life, but the object Yuha had given birth to was unlike anything his court knew how to classify. It was not a child. It was an egg, large and dark, and the king could not decide whether it was a sign or a bad omen. He chose the second. The egg was thrown to the pigs. The pigs would not touch it. It was thrown to the horses. The horses stepped around it. Men were sent to leave it in the mountains. Birds came and covered it with their wings, keeping it warm through the cold. Every attempt to destroy it failed. So the egg came back to Yuha, and from it, eventually, a boy emerged. He learned to walk. He learned to speak. But the skill that would follow him through every record, every painting, and every piece of storytelling that remembered him was simpler and stranger than any of that. He could shoot a bow unlike anyone around him. In the old language of Buyeo, the word for a skilled archer was Jumong, and that became his name. The kingdom he would found was called Goguryeo. It stood for roughly 7 centuries, controlled vast territory across the northern Korean peninsula and into Manchuria, and fought armies from China to a standstill more than once. At its height, it was one of the dominant powers of East Asia, and it began, according to its own memory, with a woman holding an egg she was not supposed to keep. We are going to follow Jumong's story from that beginning, but we are going to follow it with a question underneath every scene. Not, did this happen? The records that preserve Jumong were written centuries after the man they describe, by scholars looking backward at a kingdom that had already fallen. They were not court diaries written beside him in real time. They were memories organized into meaning. The Samguk Sagi and the Samguk Yusa, the 2 great Korean historical compilations that preserve his story, were produced in the 12th and 13th centuries. They are not disposable as sources, but they are layered. So the question is not whether the egg was real. The question is, why did Goguryeo remember its founder this way? Why give him a mother connected to a river deity and a father tied to heaven? Why place him inside an egg? Why make even his escape across a river into a scene where the water itself builds him a road? Because foundation stories do not survive by accident. They survive because they answer questions a kingdom keeps asking about itself. Who are we? Where did our authority come from? Why do we have the right to exist here, on this land, in this way? Jumong is Goguryeo's answer. And inside that answer, if you listen carefully, there is something that feels less like ancient legend and more like a very old, very human kind of fear. A mother who kept him alive. A boy who grew up knowing the people around him were deciding whether to let him live. That is where the story begins. Not with a miracle, with a woman alone holding an egg she had not been allowed to throw away. Before we can understand Jumong, we have to understand where the story says he came from. His mother was Yua. In the tradition, she is placed as the daughter of Habek, a figure associated with the river. His father, Mosu, is connected to heaven, to light, to something above the ordinary world of courts and kingdoms. The 2 main sources that preserve his story have different characters worth knowing. The Samguk Sagi, compiled in 1145 by the scholar Kim Bu-shik, aims at the authority of a court chronicle. It is careful, organized, and concerned with political legitimacy. The Samguk Yusa, compiled in the late 13th century by the Buddhist monk Irun, was written with a different purpose. It preserves the stranger, older, more sacred layers of Korean memory, the traditions that formal history had trouble containing. When the 2 sources agree on the shape of a story, that agreement carries weight. When they differ, the difference itself tells you something about what each compiler needed the past to mean. Both agree on the shape of Jumong's parentage. The founder of Goguryeo was born between sky and water. That is not an accident of storytelling. Imagine what a kingdom in the northern world of rivers, mountains, and contested borders needed to say about its first king. It needed to say his authority did not come from a human rival. It needed to say he was not merely the strongest man in the room, because the strongest man in the room can always be replaced by someone stronger. So the story gave him two parents who are not quite human. A father of light, unreachable by ordinary succession. A mother of the river, connected to the land through water, through the geography the kingdom would eventually call its own. Yua's role in the story is worth slowing down for. She is not a simple supporting figure. She is moved between worlds, from the river to an encounter with Haemosu, to the court of King Gumwa in Buyeo. She is watched over by the king. She is neither free nor imprisoned. She is somewhere in between, which is exactly where a story needs the mother of a miraculous child to be. And then, according to the tradition, sunlight reaches her. She tries to move away from it. The light follows her. In time, she gives birth to an egg. For a modern audience, that is the moment that invites the easiest skepticism. But the egg is not there to test your belief in biology. It is there to solve a political problem. A child born from an ordinary womb belongs to an ordinary family. An ordinary family can be outranked, displaced, or forgotten. But a child born from an egg that animals will not harm, that men cannot destroy, that birds shelter in the cold, belongs to a sign. You cannot rank a sign. You cannot outrank a miracle. The egg says something that no court document could say. Before anyone in Buyeo had the power to accept or reject this child, the world outside Buyeo had already made its decision. That is what Heavenly Fathers and River Mothers are doing inside Foundation stories. They are pulling the Founder's authority out of reach of human rivalry. When a king in a later age might question whether Goguryeo royal line had the right to rule, the answer was not a legal document. The answer was, their first king was not born of normal means. His mother came from the river. His father came from the sky. The egg that carried him could not be broken. That claim is impossible to defeat with a counter-argument. Jumong grew up in Buyeo. That detail is easy to pass over, but it is one of the most important facts in his story. He did not grow up in exile, safely distant from power. He grew up inside the court of King Gumwa, a king who had chosen not to destroy the egg and now had to live with that decision, walking through his halls. Jumong learned what a royal household looked like from the inside. He learned its language, its rhythms, its hierarchy. And somewhere inside that world, he developed a skill that made his presence impossible to ignore. He could shoot a bow unlike anyone around him. The records say he made his own bows and arrows as a child. They say he almost never missed. In the northern world where Buyeo and the future Goguryeo existed, this was not a decorative talent. Archery was the language of power. Hunters used it to survive winter. Warriors used it to defend fortified settlements and raid rival ones. Mounted archers were among the most feared figures in the region's military culture. A founder who could shoot was not simply gifted. He was legible to the world he would one day rule. But the bow also created a problem. A child born from a mysterious egg might be tolerated if he grew into someone quiet and forgettable. A child born from a mysterious egg who could outshoot every man in the kingdom was something else entirely. He was a rival before he had a faction. He was a possible king before anyone had said the word. King Gumwa's sons began to notice. The one remembered most clearly is Daeso, a prince whose name in later tradition becomes almost synonymous with the danger closing around Jumong. Daeso and his brothers went to their father with a warning that was also a request. The young man should not be allowed to live. The king hesitated. He gave Jumong a task instead. Jumong was put in charge of the royal horses. It could be read as a humiliation, placing a young man of sacred origin among animals, or as a test of patience. Jumong treated it as neither. He studied the horses quietly and carefully. He identified the best animal in the herd and fed it poorly, just enough to keep it alive, but little enough that the horse appeared weak and thin. When the king came to inspect the herd and claim the strongest-looking animals for himself, the best horse was passed over. It went to Jumong. That episode is one of the most revealing in the entire legend. Not because it demonstrates supernatural ability, but because it shows something the egg and the Heavenly Father cannot show by themselves. He was paying attention. He understood that inside a hostile court, appearing weak could be a form of survival. He was not waiting for heaven to solve his problems. He was working within the constraints he had been given and finding the edge that would matter later. Political intelligence. The story was building something more complicated than a miracle. But even a gifted man cannot survive indefinitely inside a court that has decided to fear him. Daeso's patience was running out, and Yuhwa, who had once sheltered an unbreakable egg, could see what was coming. It was Yuhwa who told him to go. The records do not give us a detailed account of that conversation. What they preserve is the shape of it. She prepared grain for the journey. She understood that the princes were no longer going to wait for the king to make a decision. Jumong did not leave alone. He left with 3 companions, Oi, Mari, and Hyupbo. Their names have survived where thousands of other names from that time have not, and the reason is simple. A kingdom is not founded by one man moving alone through empty space. Even a man chosen by heaven needs people who will follow him before he is worth following. Oi, Mari, and Hyupbo gave him the first shape of a future court. Before Goguryeo had a capital, it had a group. Before it had a throne, it had loyalty. Before it had a name that anyone outside Jolbon would recognize, it had 3 men who chose to follow someone who had nothing to offer them except the story of where he came from. That choice matters. Foundation stories often focus so completely on the founder that his companions become scenery. But a leader without followers is not yet a leader. The decision Oi, Mari, and Hyupbo made on the night they left Buyeo was as much a founding act as anything Jumong would do on the far side of the river. Behind them, as they moved south from Buyeo, were the forces Daeso had sent. The pursuit that follows is one of the tensest passages in the legend, and it reminds you of something the sacred elements can make easy to forget. The Heavenly Father and the River Mother and the unbreakable egg did not make Jumong invulnerable. He still had to run. He still needed to move faster than the men behind him. He reached a river. The records give it different names in different versions. What every version agrees on is the same moment. He could not cross. The water was too wide. His companions were with him. His pursuers were closing the distance. And Jumong, who had survived the hostile court by staying quiet and watching carefully, reached the edge of the world he knew and found that he had run out of options. What he did next is the moment the myth carries forward across every retelling. He called out to the river. He identified himself as the son of Hae-Mosu and the grandchild of Habek, the river deity whose daughter was his mother. He told the water who he was, and the fish and the turtles rose from the depths and formed a bridge beneath his feet. He crossed. His pursuers reached the bank. The bridge dissolved. This is not the kind of detail that can be quietly moved past by noting that some rivers have shallow crossings. The story does not want it explained away. It wants you to feel what it meant to a kingdom that told this moment to its children for centuries. A man who should have died in Buyeo was now standing on the far bank. The water had chosen. But before we move across that river with him, it is worth staying on the bank for a moment longer. Because what just happened in the story is doing more than solving a travel problem. A boat would have solved the practical problem. A boat would have gotten him across the water, but it would have left the story open. A man who escapes in a boat is a man who is lucky enough to find a boat. His authority on the other side depends on what he does next, and only on that. What the fish and turtles solve is a different kind of problem, the kind that foundation stories spend most of their energy on. The river crossing in the Jumong legend is a mythic judgment. The water is not neutral, it chooses. The natural world carries the future founder and denies access to the forces pursuing him. That is not merely dramatic, It is a political statement encoded in a scene. Without the miracle, Jumong's departure from Buyeo could look like failure. A prince who ran from a court that did not want him. A refugee who escaped by luck. The questions that kind of founding leaves open are uncomfortable. Why should the people on the other side accept him? What is his claim to anything, now that he has lost the protection of Gyeongwa's court? The river crossing answers those questions before they are asked. When Jumong calls out and identifies himself as the grandchild of Habek, he is not making a desperate claim. He is invoking a lineage, the story built into him from before his birth. His mother is the river deity's daughter. The water recognizes family. So the crossing ties together what might have stayed separate. The Heavenly Father gives Jumong the authority to be a king. The River Mother gives him the right to belong to the land he is crossing into. When both of those forces converge at the edge of a river, the man who crosses does not arrive on the other side as a stateless fugitive. He arrives carrying the recognition of heaven above him and the water beneath him. The people who waited for him in the south were not being asked to take a chance on a refugee. They were being invited to recognize someone the world had already recognized. There is one more thing the river crossing does that is easy to miss. Goguryeo was a kingdom of rivers. Its territory was shaped by river corridors, mountain passes, and the water routes that connected and divided the northern world. A founder who crossed a river by divine recognition is not only a miraculous individual. He is a figure mapped onto the physical landscape his kingdom would inhabit. The bridge of fish and turtles is not floating in abstract myth. It is planted in the kind of river Goguryeo's people lived beside. On one bank, Buyeo, the old royal house, the jealousy that had followed him from the moment the egg arrived. On the other, uncertainty, but also open ground. A place where a new story had room to begin. The man who stepped onto the far bank was no longer only a hunted prince. He was a man the river had let pass, in the language of the story, that everything that came next had already been approved. After the river, the story comes down to earth. Jumong reached the region the records call Jolbon. He was alive, his companions were with him, and he carried an origin story powerful enough to command attention. But he did not have a kingdom. A kingdom needs more than a miraculous arrival. It needs land. It needs people who are already living on that land and who have to decide whether this newcomer is a threat or an opportunity. It needs marriages, grain stores, fortifications, and relationships with local families who have been there far longer than the man now standing at the edge of their world. This is where Sosuno enters the story. The records are not perfectly consistent about her origins. Different sources give her different connections, and we should be honest about that uncertainty. What the sources agree on is the pattern of her role. She was a woman of standing in Jolbon, connected to existing power in the region, and her relationship with Jumong was not simply romantic. It was political. Through her, Jumong did not have to conquer Jolbon by force, or prove himself solely through the weight of his sacred story. He joined with the power that was already there. He negotiated. He became legible to Jolbon through a relationship that Jolbon already understood. That is the quietest part of the founding. Quieter than the egg, quieter than the river bridge. But it may be the most honest. Kingdoms are not built by sacred origin alone. A man may cross a river by divine recognition, but after he reaches the other side, people still have to decide whether to follow him. Warriors have to commit. Families have to trust. Local elites have to determine whether this arriving figure is something they can work with. Sosuno represents the answer being yes. Her later story adds another layer. Her sons are connected in later tradition to the founding of Baekje, one of the other great kingdoms of the Korean peninsula. The memory of this one woman touches the beginnings of two separate royal lines. That is not the treatment given to a minor figure. That is the treatment given to someone whose actual historical importance the records preserved, even when they could not fully explain it. The traditional date for the founding of Goguryeo is 37 BCE. Historians treat that date carefully. Kingdoms do not appear complete on a single morning. They form through processes, consolidations of territory, slow accumulation of loyal households, gradual assertion of authority over neighboring groups. The date of 37 BCE is a remembered beginning, a way of turning a complex regional development into a story with a clear starting point. But remembered beginnings matter. They give a kingdom a fixed place to return to when it needs to know who it is. Jumong became Dongmyeong, the king of Eastern brightness. The title is not modest. It places the founder at the intersection of sacred direction and illuminated authority. The boy who emerged from an unbreakable egg in Buyeo now had a throne name and a kingdom. But the story was still not finished with its work. Goguryeo fell in 668 CE, more than 7 centuries after its traditional founding date. The kingdom is gone. Its territory is divided among modern states. Many of its records did not survive. The language spoken at its courts is lost. But Jumong survived. His story was preserved in the Samguk Sagi and the Samguk Yusa, compiled in a later Korea that had inherited the memory of Goguryeo without inheriting the kingdom itself. His name left an echo in Goguryeo, the medieval dynasty that followed, and through Goguryeo, eventually, in the word Korea, as it came to be known in foreign usage. Why does a myth survive when the kingdom around it collapses? The simplest answer is that the story was never only about Goguryeo. Every major element in the Jumong legend was solving a problem that kingdoms keep having. Not just Goguryeo in the 1st century BCE, but any community trying to explain why it exists and why it has the right to continue. The egg solved the problem of ordinary birth. A king born the usual way can always be replaced by someone stronger. A king born from an unbreakable egg was marked before any human rivalry could reach him. The Heavenly Father solved the problem of authority. Power that descends from heaven cannot be argued away by someone with a better genealogy. The River Mother solved the problem of belonging. The sky gives command. The water gives place. Jumong needed both to arrive as something more than a wanderer. The jealous princes solved the problem of legitimacy by contrast. Goguryeo was not simply established. It was established in spite of people who tried to stop it before it began. That kind of founding is harder to dismiss. The river crossing solved the problem of departure. Leaving Buyeo could have looked like failure. The fish and turtles turned it into recognition. He did not flee, he was delivered. Sosano and Jolbon solved the problem of arrival. Sacred origin explains a founder. Local alliance explains a kingdom. A man may cross a river on a bridge of living water, but after he reaches the far bank, he still needs a woman of Jolbon to help him build something that will last past his own lifetime. Taken together, those solutions answer the question that every new kingdom has to answer. Why should this royal line rule? Because its founder was not merely ambitious. He was marked before he could speak. He survived rejection before he could fight back. He crossed when the world opened for him. He built where someone already trusted him enough to stay. This is the work that myths do. Not lie, not merely decorate. Organize memory into a shape that a community can carry forward. A chronicle can record that a leader moved from one territory to another. A myth can record that the river recognized him when men tried to kill him. Both may point toward the same historical reality, a break with an older world, a dangerous transition, and the creation of something new on the other side. The myth gives that reality a form that feels inevitable rather than accidental, which is exactly what Goguryeo needed its founding to feel like. The KBS drama, Jumong, ran for over 80 episodes and was watched across Korea, across Asia, and, through translation and broadcast, in parts of the world far from the peninsula where Goguryeo once stood. It gave faces, costumes, and dialogue to a story that had existed before then mainly in a few dense pages of medieval historical compilation. It worked because the original story was already built for a wide audience. Not an ancient audience only, a human one. We do not live in a world where royal authority descends from heaven. We do not settle questions of political legitimacy by pointing to miraculous births. The mechanics of the Jumong legend are not our mechanics. But the emotional shape of the story is ours. We understand a child born into danger. We understand a mother who protects him when no one else will. We understand the slow accumulation of jealousy in a room where one person is more gifted than the rest. We understand what it means to reach the edge of one life before another has agreed to receive you. We understand the river. Not the literal river with its fish and turtles. The moment the river represents. The moment when everything you could do has been done, when there is nothing behind you worth returning to, and nothing ahead that has agreed to let you in. That moment is not ancient. It is the oldest modern thing there is. The records that preserved Jumong understood this. When the Samguk Sagi arrives at the egg, at the escape, at the river crossing, it does not rush. It lets the story breathe. It understands that what it is passing forward is not only information about a founding date and a royal title. It is a shape that tells you what beginning looks like from the inside. Not the clean beginning of a declaration or a ceremony. The difficult beginning. The one that starts with a mother holding something she was told to throw away. The one that moves through a hostile court and a night escape and a river that had no reason to help. Jumong cannot be fully recovered as a historical figure. He stands at the edge of what records can reach, and beyond that edge, the story takes over. We cannot tell you which detail was memory, and which was symbol, and which was added later to fill a silence. But we can tell you what the story was doing while it carried him forward. It was giving Goguryeo a beginning it could believe in. Not because the beginning required no faith, but because it required exactly the right kind. A child the court could not destroy. A boy whose skill the court could not dismiss. A man whose departure the river chose to honor. A kingdom that grew from exile and alliance, and the decision of one woman in Jolbon to trust what had arrived across the water. That is the story behind Jumong. Not a myth to be dismissed because it exceeds what evidence can hold. Not a historical record to be defended against the parts that strain belief. A foundation memory, built to last, built to carry the weight of a kingdom's need to know where it came from and why that beginning was enough. Goguryeo needed a first king who was more than a lucky warlord, so it remembered a boy in an egg, and the river that let him pass, and everything that was built on the far side.